Captain Elias Moore had spent countless hours alone in the dense forests of distant planets, yet none had ever felt like this one. The air here was thick with a strange heaviness that seemed to pull at his chest. The usual hum of life was absent, not even the wind dared to disturb the towering trees that surrounded him. His mission was simple: gather intel on any hostile forces in the area. But something felt wrong. Something in the pit of his stomach told him he was not alone. As he moved deeper into the woods, a strange signal began to ping on his tracker. It was faint at first, barely detectable, but persistent enough to draw him closer to the source. It was coming from a clearing ahead. His boots made no sound against the thick undergrowth that carpeted the forest floor. It was almost as if the entire world was holding its breath. Elias's hand instinctively moved to the blaster at his side. As he entered the clearing, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a figure tall and impossibly beautiful, with skin that shimmered in the dim light as if she were made of liquid silver. Her eyes glowed faintly, a soft light that pierced through the shadows surrounding them. Every part of her seemed otherworldly, like a vision from a forgotten legend. She didn't move, not even an inch, just stood there watching him. Elias froze, his heart pounding against his ribs, his breath caught in his throat. He had heard the stories of the ancients, the beings said to have ruled the stars long before humanity had ever risen from the dust. But those were just stories whispered in the dark corners of space by those who feared what they did not understand. No one had ever truly believed them. Yet here she stood in front of him, and everything he had ever been told seemed insignificant in her presence. There was power in her stillness, an undeniable energy that filled the air and made his skin tingle. Every part of his military training screamed at him to assess the situation, to find out if she was a threat, but the thought of harming her seemed impossible. The woman's eyes met his, and Elias felt a jolt run through him, not just a look, but a direct connection, as though she had somehow reached into his very soul. And in that instant he understood something. He couldn't explain. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He wasn't supposed to be here. No one was supposed to witness her, not like this. No one was supposed to find her. The stories had said the ancients had vanished into the void of time, that they had sealed themselves away to protect the galaxy from the consequences of their own power. But here she was alive, and watching him, as if waiting for something to happen. His heart thudded harder in his chest. A mix of awe and fear flooded his senses. A part of him wanted to turn and run, to pretend he had never seen this place or this being, but something deep inside told him that he couldn't, that he wasn't meant to turn away. Not now, not when the fate of everything seemed to be balancing on a single moment. Elias took a cautious step forward, his hand still resting on the grip of his blaster, though his instincts screamed at him to lower it. The woman did not move, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that felt as though it was piercing straight through to his very thoughts. He swallowed hard, the weight of the moment suffocating him. He wanted to speak, to ask her who she was, what she wanted, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. A voice, soft yet resonant, suddenly filled his mind. It was not a voice he heard with his ears, but one that seemed to vibrate within his consciousness. "You are not meant to be here," the voice whispered, carrying an ancient weight. The words were not threatening, but they were filled with a quiet power that made him freeze in place. He took another step, this time with more resolve. "I don't understand," Elias thought, his voice reaching out into the silence. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes shifted slightly, as if acknowledging his mental words. Then, to his astonishment, she spoke aloud, her voice ethereal and commanding. "I am Teria, one of the ancients, a being born before time as you know it." Her voice seemed to echo in his mind even after she spoke, leaving a lingering trace of the impossible truth she had just revealed. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. The ancients. He had heard the myths, the whispered stories passed down through secret texts and rumors from long-forgotten corners of the galaxy, but none of it seemed real. Until now. She stood before him, her presence overwhelming yet not hostile, just alien. "Why are you here?" Elias asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain composed. "I thought the ancients were gone." "We are gone," Teria replied, her gaze never leaving his. "But some of us remain, hidden away from the universe. We are the forgotten ones, the ones who were never meant to be seen again." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "But you're here. You're alive." Terria's eyes narrowed slightly, as though considering how much to reveal. "Yes," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "I have been asleep for eons, kept hidden in the shadows, waiting for the moment the galaxy would need us again. But that time is not yet upon us. You were never meant to find me. No one was meant to find me." The air around them seemed to grow thicker as she spoke, and Elias could feel the tension in the atmosphere. There was something dangerous here, something beyond what he understood, and yet he couldn't bring himself to turn away. "What do you want from me?" he asked, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. He was no fool. He knew that being in her presence meant his life could change in an instant. The galaxy had known no greater force than the ancients, and for a moment, Elias wondered if he was standing at the edge of something far more significant than his mission had ever prepared him for. Terria's gaze softened, though there was still an edge of something sorrowful in her eyes. "I do not need anything from you," she said slowly. "But you are the one chosen to bear witness to my return. You are the one who will carry the knowledge of the ancients forward. The universe is not ready for us yet, but you may be." Elias felt a mix of confusion and awe. He had always thought of himself as just a soldier, a cog in the massive machine of the Federation. But now, standing before the last of a forgotten race, he realized he had been drawn into something far greater than he could ever imagine. Elias stood in stunned silence, trying to process the words that Teria had just spoken. The weight of her revelation pressed down on him, almost suffocating in its gravity. A part of him wanted to run, to escape this moment and pretend it had never happened, but he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as if some invisible force was holding him in place. What do you mean by chosen?" Elias finally asked, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. "I'm just a soldier. I don't know anything about your people or their history." Terria's gaze softened ever so slightly, a faint shimmer of recognition in her eyes. "You are more than you think, Elias, more. You have always been more. I did not choose you because of your knowledge, but because of your heart. The ancients could sense your presence even before you knew of us." Her words were cryptic, filled with a kind of ancient wisdom that felt far beyond his comprehension. Elias frowned, struggling to grasp what she was saying. "But I don't understand. If the ancients were so powerful, why did you leave? Why hide away?" Teria sighed, a sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the forest. "We left because we knew our power was too great. It was a danger to the universe. Our influence began to corrupt even those who sought peace, turning the balance of the galaxy into something unrecognizable. We foresaw the consequences and made the decision to exile ourselves, to fade from memory so that others would not fall into the same trap. But some of us, like me, remain hidden, awaiting a time when the galaxy might be ready for us once more." Elias listened, his mind racing. The idea of an entire race of beings capable of such immense power, and then choosing to disappear, was almost beyond belief. It was like something from the oldest myths, stories passed down by the elders, but never truly believed. And now, standing in front of him, was proof that those stories were real. Teria was proof. "So why now?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why have you awakened now?" Terria's eyes flickered with something darker, a deep sorrow that seemed to touch the very core of her being. "Because the darkness is rising again. Forces from beyond this galaxy have begun to stir, and they seek the power of the ancients to fuel their own conquest. The galaxy is not yet ready for our return, but we may not have a choice. The enemy grows stronger with each passing day." Elias could feel the weight of her words settle in the pit of his stomach. An enemy, a threat far worse than anything he had encountered before, was on the horizon. The galaxy was not ready. He was not ready. And yet, Here he was, standing in front of one of the last beings capable of stopping it. The responsibility of it all was almost too much to bear. "Then, what do you need from me?" Elias asked, his voice tight. Terria's gaze shifted, a flicker of something dangerous in her eyes. "I need you to protect me, to help me find what remains of the ancients' knowledge. The universe may not be ready for us, but it will not survive without us. And I believe you are the key to unlocking what is needed to save it." Elias's heart raced as he processed her words. She had chosen him, not for his skills as a soldier, but for something deeper, something about him that she could see but that he could not. He glanced around the clearing, the silent trees, the oppressive weight of the air, and then looked back at her. "Protect you," he repeated, trying to steady his thoughts. "But from what? Who's coming for you?" Terria's expression hardened, and the faint glow in her eyes intensified. "From those who seek to control what they do not understand. From the ones who will stop at nothing to use our power for their own ends. They are already on their way." Elias's mind raced. The universe, as he had known it, was about to change forever. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if he was ready for it. Elias could feel the weight of Terria's words settling on his shoulders, and with it, a deep sense of urgency. The enemy was coming, and time was running out. He glanced around the clearing, the stillness of the forest now suffocating in its silence. Every instinct he had as a soldier told him to prepare for battle, to strategize, but there was no time. He had no idea who these enemies were or what they could do. Before he could respond, a distant rumble echoed through the trees, faint but unmistakable. Elias's hand instinctively went to his blaster, his senses sharpening. He looked to Teria, expecting her to react, but she remained as still as ever. "The enemy is already here," she said quietly, as if she had known it was coming all along. Her eyes flashed, her body tensing for the fight. "They are never far behind." Elias scanned the surrounding forest, his pulse quickening as the air around them began to hum with tension. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet. There was something he couldn't quite place, that told him the approaching threat wasn't just a group of mercenaries or raiders. No, this felt different. The presence was unnatural, and it seemed to be closing in faster with each passing second. A flash of movement caught his eye. Figures, dark, cloaked in shadow, moving with unnatural precision, emerged from the tree line. Elias's heart skipped a beat as they materialized in full view. The attackers wore armor that glimmered with strange, otherworldly symbols, their faces obscured by sleek helmets. They moved with a terrifying synchrony, as if they were part of a single, unyielding force. "Stay close to me," Teria commanded, her voice sharp, almost in order. "I will protect you, but you must trust me. Don't hesitate." Elias's throat tightened. Trust her. He had barely known her for a few hours, yet here he was, standing next to a being older than time itself, facing an enemy he couldn't even begin to understand. And still, something in him, a flicker of certainty, told him that she was right. She was the only one who could protect him now. The attackers closed in, moving as if they knew exactly where to strike. Teria raised her hand, and with a single motion, the ground beneath them cracked, a surge of energy rippling outward like a shockwave. The attackers faltered, thrown off balance, their weapons momentarily disabled. Elias watched in awe as Teria's power rippled through the forest, bending the environment itself to her will. But even as they stumbled, the attackers quickly regained their composure, their weapons crackling with energy. The first shots rang out, but Elias barely had time to react before Teria moved. Her speed was inhuman, her movements a blur as she intercepted the attacks with a grace that left him breathless. She held out her hand, and the air around her shimmered, deflecting the enemy's energy blasts. The sound of impact echoed through the clearing, but Elias could barely keep up with the ferocity of the battle unfolding before him. "They are after me," Teria said, her voice colder now, as if she had momentarily stepped beyond any human concern. "Do not let them get close." Elias's pulse thundered in his ears. His training kicked in, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The enemy wasn't just after her. They were after the power she held, the ancient knowledge she guarded. As one of them advanced toward her, Elias raised his blaster, aiming carefully, and fired. The shot hit its mark, but it barely slowed the attacker down. It was as if the armor they wore absorbed the impact with ease. Terria's eyes flashed with renewed intensity. She raised both hands this time, and the attackers were sent flying backward by a wave of invisible force. They slammed into the trees with a sickening thud, leaving Elias momentarily stunned at the sheer power she wielded. "We cannot stay here," she said urgently, turning toward Elias. "We must move before more arrive. There is a place we can hide. Follow me." With a final glance at the fallen attackers, Elias nodded, his heart still racing from the battle that had just unfolded. The forest around them was still, but he knew they wouldn't be alone for long. He followed Teria, his mind spinning, as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. He had crossed into a world far beyond anything he had ever imagined, and there was no turning back now. As Elias followed Teria through the dense forest, his mind raced. The battle had left him shaken, but it was clear that the danger was far from over. They moved quickly, Teria's pace swift and effortless, while Elias struggled to keep up. The forest around them seemed to close in as they moved deeper into its heart, the trees growing thicker, their trunks twisting in strange, unnatural ways. It was as if the very land itself was guiding them, responding to Teria's presence. Elias glanced over at her, trying to make sense of everything. She was silent, her eyes focused ahead, her every movement deliberate and controlled. It was impossible to ignore the power she radiated, a power that seemed to warp the air around them, as though the world bent to her will. He couldn't help but feel like he was walking beside a force of nature, something beyond human understanding. "Why did they come for you?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the silence between them. "Who are they?" Teria's gaze remained fixed ahead, but her expression darkened. "They are called the Seekers," she replied, her voice tinged with something bitter. "A faction of those who once served my people. They were our greatest allies, until they became obsessed with the power we held. They sought to use it for themselves, to control the galaxy." Elias frowned, processing her words. "So, they were once part of your people?" "Not exactly," Teria said. "They were created by us, engineered to serve as our protectors, but over time, they became twisted by their own ambitions. When we decided to seal ourselves away, they were the ones left behind to guard our secrets. But they grew impatient, and they turned on us. Now they seek to reclaim the knowledge of the ancients, no matter the cost." The weight of her words settled heavily on Elias's chest. He had always thought of the galaxy as a place of order, where the powerful were kept in check by the laws of the Federation. But here he was, in the midst of something far darker and more complex. The Seekers weren't just enemies. They were a perversion of what the ancients had once stood for, a twisted reflection of a past he could hardly fathom. "They want to use your power," Elias said, more to himself than to her. "They want to control it." Teria nodded slowly, her expression distant. "Yes, and if they succeed, they will destroy everything. The balance of the galaxy will crumble, and the darkness we try to escape will return." Elias felt a chill creep down his spine. "Then what do we do? How do we stop them?" Teria stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her eyes were intense, burning with a fire that sent a shiver through him. "We find what remains of the ancients' knowledge," she said, her voice firm. "There is a place, a sanctuary, where the last of our power is hidden. If we can reach it before the Seekers, we may have a chance to stop them." Elias's heart raced as he took in her words. He had known that the stakes were high, but now he understood just how far-reaching the consequences were. The fate of the galaxy itself rested on their ability to reach this sanctuary, to unlock the secrets of the ancients before it was too late. Teria began walking again, her pace quicker now, as if the urgency of their mission had been heightened by their conversation. Elias kept close behind, his mind racing with the realization that he was no longer just a soldier on a routine mission. He was part of something much larger, something that could change the course of history. As they moved deeper into the forest, Elias could feel the weight of the universe pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if they would even make it to the sanctuary in time. But one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more surreal the surroundings became. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting into strange shapes, and the air seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Elias felt a creeping sense of unease settle over him, as though the very land was watching them. He had trained for battles, for hostile encounters, but this felt different. The forest itself seemed alive, and the farther they went, the more aware he became of how vulnerable he was in this foreign environment. Teria walked ahead, her steps sure and confident, as though the strange surroundings held no mystery for her. She seemed at ease, as if the forest were as much a part of her as the sky above. Elias tried to focus on her, to follow her lead, but his mind kept drifting back to the Seekers. They were getting closer, he could feel it in his bones. The rumbling in the distance hadn't stopped, and the eerie quiet around them suggested they were walking towards something ominous. Suddenly, Teria stopped. Elias, too, halted just behind her. The air grew thick, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade into an unnatural silence. Teria's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. A soft pulse of light flickered in her eyes, and she turned to face Elias. "They are close," she whispered, her voice low but urgent. "We do not have much time." Elias's heart pounded in his chest, and his hand instinctively reached for his blaster. He knew they were out of their element here, but something about the way Teria spoke made him uneasy. She didn't seem afraid. No, she seemed resolute. She had dealt with worse than the Seekers, he was sure of it. But that didn't mean they were out of danger. "What do we do now?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. Teria looked toward the horizon, her eyes scanning the shadows beyond the trees. "We have to reach the sanctuary. It is hidden deep within this forest, where the Seekers cannot easily follow. But the path is treacherous. We must move quickly and quietly." Elias nodded, trying to steady his breath. He had no idea what this sanctuary was, but the way Teria spoke about it made him feel like it was more than just a place. It was a key, something crucial to their survival. If they didn't reach it in time, the Seekers would find them, and they would be at the mercy of those who sought to control the ancient power Teria guarded. As they began to move again, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to whisper around them, the branches creaking and shifting as though alive. Every step they took felt like a step deeper into the unknown. The forest was a labyrinth of shifting paths, and Elias couldn't tell if they were making progress or walking in circles. He had no reference point here, no map to guide him. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of movement in the distance. Elias's hand flew to his blaster, his pulse racing. Teria raised a hand, signaling him to stay still. She closed her eyes for a moment, her face a mask of concentration. When she opened them again, her gaze was hard, determined. "They're close," she said, her voice a whisper of command. "We must move faster." Elias's heart pounded as they sprinted through the thick undergrowth, their movements swift and deliberate. He could feel the ground vibrating beneath him, the forest seemingly alive with energy. They weren't alone, not anymore. The Seekers had found them. A flash of light burst through the trees, and Elias barely had time to react before the first energy blast fired at them. Teria moved with lightning speed, her hand raised to deflect the blast, sending it spiraling harmlessly into the sky. But Elias knew they couldn't keep this up for long. They needed to reach the sanctuary. They needed to escape. The distant rumble of the Seekers' pursuit grew louder, echoing through the trees like thunder. Elias's muscles burned as they pushed forward, the sense of imminent danger hanging over them like a shadow. He could hear the Seekers' footsteps behind them now, their movements synchronized, relentless. Teria was ahead, guiding them through the forest with an eerie precision, but Elias felt the weight of every second pressing down on him. The sanctuary was close, he knew it. But would they make it in time? The sound of the Seekers grew louder, reverberating through the trees, and Elias's heart hammered in his chest. They were closing in. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the forest itself was trying to hold them back. The path ahead became more difficult, the underbrush thick and tangled, but Teria moved with an effortless grace, her pace unbroken as if the obstacles were mere inconveniences. Elias could barely keep up, his legs burning as he pushed through the dense foliage. "They're gaining on us," Elias panted, his voice tight with urgency. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going, not with the speed the Seekers were moving. They had far more endurance and coordination than he did. But Teria was something else. She was a force of nature, her determination unwavering, but even she couldn't outrun an entire faction. They needed to reach the sanctuary, and fast. Teria's eyes flashed, her expression grim. She stopped suddenly, holding up her hand to signal him to stay back. Elias froze just behind her, his breath shallow and quick, as he watched her carefully. She was staring at something in the distance, her senses heightened. "They're not far now," she murmured, barely audible over the rustling of the forest. "But there is something else, something more dangerous than them." Elias felt a chill creep up his spine. He had thought the Seekers were the only threat, but now Teria was sensing something else, something that made her uneasy. "What do you mean?" Elias asked, his voice low. "What's worse than them?" Teria didn't answer right away, her gaze narrowing as she turned her attention back to the path ahead. She seemed to be searching for something, her eyes scanning the shadows. The air around them grew still, and for a moment it was as though time itself had paused. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Elias's stomach lurched as the earth shook violently, the trees swaying dangerously. "There's no time," Teria said, her voice sharp. "We need to move now." Before Elias could react, she turned and sprinted forward, faster than he thought possible. The trembling intensified, and Elias's instincts kicked in. He followed, pushing himself harder, his blaster held tightly in his hand. But the ground continued to shake, and it felt as though the forest was alive, responding to an unseen force. The tremors were growing stronger. The air was thick with tension, crackling with an energy that made his hair stand on end. As they pushed through the underbrush, Elias could see a faint, glowing light ahead, an unnatural radiance that cut through the dense trees like a beacon in the dark. The sanctuary. But just as they neared it, a sudden roar echoed through the forest, so loud and guttural that it nearly knocked Elias off his feet. He stumbled, glancing around in panic. The sound came again, closer this time, a terrifying growl that vibrated deep within his chest. He looked to Teria, but she was already moving ahead, her face etched with resolve. "It's here," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "The guardian of the sanctuary." The roar echoed once more, closer than before. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath them split open, and from the fissure emerged a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It was massive, towering over them with dark, armored scales that gleamed in the light of the sanctuary's glow. Its eyes were like burning embers, and its mouth gaped wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The guardian. Elias's pulse raced as the creature let out another deafening roar, shaking the ground beneath them. It was clear that the creature wasn't going to let them pass without a fight. Teria stood firm, her expression unwavering as she raised her hands, the glow of ancient power beginning to flare around her. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "This will be the hardest trial yet." Elias's heart thudded in his chest as the guardian lunged toward them, its massive claws slashing the air with terrifying speed. He raised his blaster, But Teria was already moving, her power crackling as she faced the Guardian head-on. This was it. They were at the threshold of the sanctuary, but first, they had to survive what waited in the shadows. The Guardian lunged with terrifying speed, its massive claws slashing through the air. Elias barely had time to react before Teria stepped forward, raising her hands to meet the creature head-on. A burst of energy shot from her, crackling with raw otherworldly power. The force of the blast slammed into the Guardian, sending it skidding back several feet, its claws scraping the ground with a deafening screech. Elias watched, awestruck, as Teria stood her ground, her face a mask of concentration. She wasn't just fighting. It was as if she was controlling the very essence of the world around her, bending the energy to her will. The Guardian roared in frustration, shaking off the impact, its glowing eyes burning with fury. "You have to trust me now," Teria said, her voice calm amidst the chaos. She didn't even glance back at Elias as she raised her hands again, her power surging in the air like a storm. Elias's heart raced. He didn't know what she was about to do, but he knew it was their only chance. He kept his blaster raised, scanning the battlefield, ready to fire if the creature made another move. But he also knew that this wasn't a fight he could win on his own. It was up to Teria now. The Guardian charged again, its massive body a blur of motion, its claws cutting through the air toward them. Teria's eyes flared with light, and with a sharp movement, she gestured toward the ground beneath them. The earth split open, sending waves of energy cascading out from her, forcing the Guardian to halt its charge. It howled in rage as the earth trembled, the forest shaking violently beneath them. Elias barely kept his footing as the ground shifted, but his eyes remained fixed on Teria. She wasn't just controlling the earth. She was drawing on something ancient, something that made the very land respond to her will. The air around them was thick with energy, and Elias felt the power radiating from her in waves. The Guardian recoiled, momentarily stunned by the force of Teria's power, but it wasn't defeated. With a guttural roar, it charged again, its massive claws aimed directly at Teria. She wasn't fast enough to dodge, but in an instant, a barrier of shimmering light surrounded her, deflecting the claws as they struck with brutal force. The barrier held, but the impact sent shockwaves through the forest, knocking Elias off balance. "Get to the sanctuary," Teria shouted, her voice strained with effort. "I'll hold it off." Elias hesitated for a moment, torn between staying to help and following her command. But the glow from the sanctuary, so close now, was his only hope. He could see it, feel it, as if the very energy of the place was calling to him. He knew what he had to do. With a final glance at Teria, Elias turned and sprinted toward the sanctuary. His legs burned with exhaustion, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The Guardian's roar echoed in the distance, but he couldn't afford to look back. The sanctuary was within reach. He reached the glowing entrance just as the earth trembled again beneath his feet. A final, desperate cry from the Guardian echoed through the trees. But as Elias stepped into the sanctuary, the air seemed to shift. The energy around him hummed with ancient power, and he felt a sudden wave of clarity wash over him. The sanctuary was more than just a place. It was a repository of knowledge, a gateway to the power that could save the galaxy. As the entrance sealed behind him, Elias turned to find Teria's image flickering in the glowing light of the sanctuary. She was still fighting, still holding the Guardian at bay, but he knew now that this was her final act. Her power was the key to their survival, and it was his turn to unlock the next chapter. Elias stood tall, his heart still racing, but now filled with a sense of purpose. The galaxy's fate rested in his hands, and he would not let it fall.